For me, the word that immediately came to mind was safe.
It definitely has to come from a place of them telling us what they need, them letting us know if this isn't working, and us being receptive to that and changing that.
I think if we lived in a world that centered them, they'd just always believe them. That fear wouldn't exist. And to respect them.
I think the word that just comes to my head is probably embrace. Embracing everyone's differences, embracing everyone's thoughts, embracing everyone's feelings.
The one thing that I can say will be at stake, and the biggest thing, is lives. We will continue to lose people if we do not center survivors.
Centering survivors means listening to them, means, having the resources to help them get better and investigate them and investigate the claims that are happening.
When we don't center survivors, it just causes everybody to hide themselves, and go through that pain all over again and, be at risk of harming themselves. I think it's just very important to listen, and I think it's very brave for somebody to talk about what happened to them.
I think a world would be liberating and equitable. And what would be at stake if we didn't, if we can't create this? I think it's humanity. I think it's everything that makes us us, and that makes a world that's supposed to be just.
YWCA's 2022 Week Without Violence, Centering on Survivors, focuses on how today's divisive issues and headlines are impacting survivors all across the country. Supreme Court decisions, state laws and policies, and a rising wave of hate and violence have created a chilling landscape for survivors and led to increasing rates of gender-based violence. According to the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, domestic violence cases have increased between 25 and 33% globally. And the National Commission on COVID and Criminal Justice Studies in the United States show that there's been an increase in the US of 8%. In February, the Domestic National Violence Hotline received more than 70,000 calls and texts, the highest monthly contact and volume during a 25-year span. YWCAs all across the country similarly have reported an increase in gender-based violence. From gun violence, including mass shootings, to reproductive health restrictions and anti-LGBTQ laws and policies, and police violence, some of our nation's most contentious issues of today are directly impacting the safety and well-being of survivors in unique and especially harmful ways. Unfortunately, these impacts are often unknown, overlooked, or actively ignored, which leaves many victims and survivors of gender-based violence unsupported in their efforts to find safety and healing. As our nation heads to the polls in the next few weeks, voters will decide the outcomes of more than 7,000 local, state, and federal offices. To ensure that all voices of survivors are heard and addressed, it's critical that we center survivors in discussions about these contentious issues and in our voter education and get out the vote. I want you to know that today I am joined by an extraordinary panel to do a deep dive into these issues and explore the critical importance of centering survivors in our discussions and our Get Out the Vote efforts. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. Rachel Graber is the Director of Public Affairs at National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where she amplifies the voices of victims, survivors, and advocates in the nation's capital. In this position, she has organized and participated in several congressional briefings about domestic violence and has been instrumental in the development of several important legislations to protect survivors and to provide services to keep firearms out of the hands of abusers. She is the chair of the National Task Force to End Sexual Violence and Domestic Violence Firearms Subcommittee and is an active participant in many other domestic violence-related and intersectional public policy. She is also one of the primary creative features behind Disarm Domestic Violence project at NCADV and Prosecutors Against Gun Violence. Disarm Domestic Violence is an interactive website to help survivors, advocates, lawyers, and lawmakers understand and use state laws governing firearm possessions by respondents to protective orders. Prior to joining NCADV, Rachel was a junior and senior high school teacher, guidance counselor, and equity coordinator in rural Iowa. Rachel holds a Master's of Social Work and a Master's of School Counseling with an endorsement in gifted education from the University of Iowa and is a graduate of Grinnell College. Francesca Rattray, CEO of YWCA San Antonio. Ms. Rattray has devoted 30 years of her career to international and community economic development through microfinance, human services, and nonprofit training. Ms. Rattray believes that investing in women is key to breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty, and YWCA San Antonio removes barriers for women, particularly women of color, to achieve self-sufficiency through childcare, youth services, and economic empowerment and health equity, along with advocacy for racial justice and gender equality. Ms. Rattray leads a team of empowered women with lived experience in the community they serve and ensures that women and families are safe, healthy, and thriving. Ms. Rattray received her MBA from Boston University and a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And Terra Russell-Slavin, Chief Impact Officer for the Los Angeles LGBTQ Center. The center is the world's largest provider of programs and services for LGBTQ people. As Chief Impact Officer, Terra works to advance LGBTQ rights and participates in all organizational decision-making as a member of the senior management team. She has specific responsibilities for executive oversight of all human services for the center, including homeless services for youth, senior services, and policy and advocacy and legal services. She is also an actively engaged member in the National LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Institute. In her more than 16 years at the center, Terra has also served as Director of Policy and Community Building and lead staff attorney. Terra is a subject matter expert on issues related to LGBTQ domestic violence and chairs the LGBTQ Subject Matter Committee for the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. She was a leader in the effort to obtain the first ever non-discrimination provision in federal law based on sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act. She also serves on the California Office of Health Equities Advisory Commission. Terra has a bachelor's degree from Pitzer College and a JD from Northeastern University School of Law.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Margaret, and welcome again to our panelists. I'd like to go ahead and get started. And to get us started, I'd like to start with a question for you, Francesca. But I'd like to, as we discussed earlier, when I ask this question and when we ask all of our questions in the future, please, to our other panelists, feel free to jump in at any point. I'd love for this to be a conversation and discussion for all of us. So, Francesca, sexual assault and intimate partner sexual violence bear long-term implications for women's mental, emotional, physical, and reproductive health, which may be seen and felt long after the violence has stopped. In addition, the effects of this violence are often compounded by poverty, racism, and lack of access to comprehensive health services, making the help-seeking and healing process much harder for some survivors. Moreover, unintended pregnancies that result from pregnancy coercion and contraceptive sabotage by intimate partners are very real dangers in the context of domestic violence. In the first half of 2022, 12 states enacted 43 abortion restrictions, with many more restrictions being introduced. In addition, the Supreme Court's recent decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade, further curtailed access to abortion care across the country. What impact have you seen these restrictions have on survivors of sexual assault and intimate partner violence? And also, how can centering survivor needs and voices ensure that access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care, including abortion care, remains available?
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you, Caitlin and Margaret, for having me here. So first, I'd really like to talk about the situation in San Antonio. San Antonio has consistently topped a list of the most populous cities with the highest poverty rate. We're at 19%, and in some areas of town, it's about 30%. So YWCA San Antonio sees its value proposition as removing barriers for women, particularly women of color, to become self-sufficient and break the cycle of generational poverty. All of the issues we're talking about today disproportionately impact poor women and poor women of color. So YWCA San Antonio has seen that to empower women with economic freedom can provide greater options for what to do when a woman becomes pregnant. We know, for example, with domestic violence, that pregnant women are twice as likely to be killed while they're pregnant and immediately after. So having economic freedom to be able to leave an abusive situation or to make your own reproductive choices is what we have been focusing on in our health equity department. We know also that maternal mortality rates have skyrocketed in the most developed country in the world, and in San Antonio, it's 12%. 12% of women have access to high quality maternal health care, and in some places it's even worse. 20% of women lack these services. So we work to not only create access, because what we've heard from physicians is that they don't know what the lived experiences are of these women that they are serving. So we try to educate and teach implicit bias to physicians who are serving women who are pregnant.
I'd like to add in, I'm a ardent believer that abortion is an LGBTQ issue, and that young LGBTQ individuals, LGBTQ women, and those with cervixes and uteri are particularly at risk of unintended pregnancy, and so abortion access is critical. And then the other part of this is, I think, how do we think about this conversation and that Dobbs decision as that line of rationale we are already seeing play out in other spaces. So recently in Texas, there was a court case that actually restricted access to PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. And this is such a critical tool, right? That if we think about sexual justice and reproductive health, like having access to tools that prevent HIV are going to be critical for LGBTQ domestic violence survivors who are at disproportionate rates. And so I think we have to see these as all linked together, and we need to be doing more in the field, I think, to be expanding health access, reproductive access, sexual health justice, and fighting back against the attempts to take those rights away.
I just really want to follow up, Terra, on what you mentioned. You have identified that there is a disproportionality to individuals who identify as LGBTQ. And abortion justice and sexual violence. Can you talk more about this wave of hate that we are really seeing and experiencing around the country, and sort of centering in Florida with bills there around most commonly known as Don't Say Gay?
Right. So right now in state legislators across the country, there are 250 bills targeting LGBTQ individuals, and in particular, I think disproportionately targeting transgender members of our community. When I think about those attacks on our community, while they're not new, I think they've gained a new momentum, and that poses such a risk for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Because if you're an LGBTQ youth who is almost 3 times more likely to experience teen dating violence, are you going to feel safe going to your teacher who can't talk about LGBTQ relationships? Are you going to feel safe going to service providers that don't necessarily have non-discrimination protections? And then you couple that, when we think also about poverty and these other issues, at our organization, we provide wraparound services for LGBTQ homeless youth. Who disproportionately, right, almost 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And so that fear that the batterer can hold, that says, I am going to tell your family, I'm going to tell these resources about your identity, could mean someone being kicked out of their family home, could mean someone loses access to a job. And all of that compounds and makes it more dangerous.
You know, YWCAs are certainly, I believe, places where LGBTQ youth particularly, find safety and welcoming and belonging. But how can we as a network continue to engage and enhance the ability for LGBTQ youth to understand that they are safe in our buildings and our programs?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it starts with being vocal and visible in support. Because so often, so much of LGBTQ youth's identity, and specifically when I think about the YWCA, is how much it's doing for Black and Brown youth, and actively engaging and trying to dismantle systemic racism, is bringing that in, also doing with a lens of dismantling anti-LGBTQ bias. Because it's really at those intersections that we see, Black and brown LGBTQ youth who are disproportionately impacted across the board. So that's, having signage, having conversations, being able to acknowledge the harm that's going on in the world. And I think that's going to help create those spaces where people can feel vulnerable and disclose what's happening in their lives.
I think that's so important. We do certainly see a high level of violence, particularly for transgendered Black individuals. And so this is a very important issue. But I want to hand it back to Caitlin for the next question.
Thank you. I wanted to pass this question actually over to Francesca a little bit. I know we had talked a little bit about the work that was happening in Texas, specifically with Black and Brown youth, especially at San Antonio. So I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about the work that you were doing there just with Black and Brown youth. I think there were some programs that you were doing with young women of color in Texas, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So we, there have been many initiatives to serve Black and Brown youth in our communities, and one is particularly about healthy relationships. We partner with an organization in San Antonio, Healthy Futures, and have a curriculum called Love Notes, which teaches about healthy relationships, not only for Black and Brown youth, but also for LGBTQ youth, being able to identify signs of unhealthy relationships so that they can break the cycle of violence and identify intimate partner violence and talk about it. We also have an in-school program that teaches about racial justice and gender equity. But there has been a movement in Texas to ban the teaching of anything that looks like what is known as critical race theory. And this is so detrimental because this curriculum teaches empathy and tolerance and could stop some of the violence that we see happening in Uvalde and elsewhere in Texas.
Yeah, as Texas, someone who grew up in Texas, was born in Texas and grew up in Texas, seeing the recent wave of laws, it's been really disheartening. And I think thinking about that youth piece, there's also an active engagement to try to get the Department of Children and Family Services there to investigate parents who are supporting their trans youth. And again, how, what an unnecessary and harmful barrier.
And it adds to the mental health crisis we're seeing in Texas, and Texas ranks near the bottom for access to mental health care. So being able to have services for youth with their mental health issues is critical for that as well. Absolutely.
And I think this brings us back to the YWCA's centering survivors and making sure that people actually think about these things when they go to the polls. And, center policies that support young people, that support people of color, that support LGBTQ people, and to support families and communities instead of marginalizing them.
Thank you, Rachel. I actually have a question that focuses a little bit on your expertise now, Rachel, if you don't mind. We know that the presence of a gun increases the risk of homicide and domestic violence by at least 500%. That most mass shootings in the U.S. are related to domestic violence, that Black women are nearly 3 times as likely to be murdered with a gun than white women, and that transgender women are 4 times more likely to experience gun violence than cisgender women. We also know that domestic violence gun homicides, including mass shootings, are on the rise. So how has gun violence, including mass shootings in recent years, impacted victims and survivors of gender-based violence? And how has it impacted how your organizations are changing the way they safety plan?
Yeah, so I actually want to take a step back before we get to homicides and talk about the role that firearms play in intimate partner violence that does not end in homicide. Because I think this is something that we overlook a lot. Almost 15% of women in the United States have been threatened by an intimate partner with a gun. 15%. That's not 15% of survivors, that's 15% of women, 6% of men. So firearms are used very frequently as a tool by which abusers assert power and coercive control, right? They threaten to kill the survivor, they threaten to kill the kids, they threaten to kill the pets, they threaten to kill family members, community members, coworkers, law enforcement, very frequently threaten to kill themselves, right? And so people say, oh, well, why doesn't she just leave? Because if she leaves, there's a very good chance that she will end up dead, right? I'm putting it very starkly, but that's just the truth, right? Of those 15% of women who are threatened by intimate partners, with firearms, 43% are injured by those firearms. So that could be a gunshot, that could be being pistol whipped, that could be being sexually assaulted with a firearm. So firearms, we focus a lot on their role in homicides, but they're just so much more pervasive in intimate partner violence than most people realize. And we know a woman is killed by an abuser with a firearm every 16 hours. Every 16 hours in the United States. Most women who are killed, who are murdered by intimate partners, and most women who are murdered by intimate partners are murdered with firearms. We talk about women in these cases because there's not a lot of good data on men, on people who are trans or non-binary, so that's why we keep talking about women. But we know that, no one is immune from domestic violence. No one is immune from intimate partner violence. It impacts people across the country, across, socioeconomic lines, across racial lines, ethnic lines, religious communities, gender identities, sexual orientation, and so people say, oh, well, it's not, the gun isn't the issue. The domestic violence is the issue. Domestic violence is an issue, yes, but there's domestic violence in communities all over the world. And you don't see a woman being killed with a gun, or a woman being killed at all, every 16 hours in other developed countries, right?
You know, this is really, as you were talking, I was just, my internal thermometer was going through the roof, you know. I really feel like this is a global issue and a global crisis. And it feels as if we are sort of not responding. I feel like, I remember reading a study just recently indicating that it's going to be between 100 and 130 years for women to achieve real parity and equity in this country. And I don't know that I'm able to wait another 100 years for this to happen. It just is, this is incredible, tragic, just so out of the bounds of what we should be comfortable with as a country and as women and as a woman of color. I'm just not able to sort of, you know, modulate and be okay with this.
You don't have to be okay with this. It is totally acceptable to be not okay with it, and no one should be okay with it. Yes, no, absolutely. You know, I think, I don't know that I am maybe most qualified to talk about the state of society in general. It does feel like in many ways it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that we make progress, and then the people who then maybe lose a little bit of their power because we're, you know, making progress, then have a backlash, and then we all have to deal with that. And then before we can inch forward again, I don't know if that sounds about right to other people as well. You know, because when we say we are promoting equity, you know, when some people have power and other people don't, and then other people get more power, these people are threatened, right? And their power is threatened, and, you know, in a way, that's not all that dissimilar to domestic violence when it's about power and coercive control and maintaining power by whatever means is necessary, you know, over the victim.
I'd love to jump in on the equity issue too. You know, we see wage equity as an equalizer, as a way to achieve parity. You know, YWCA received a grant in 2019 from United Way of San Antonio to create awareness about the wage gap between white men and women of color. And it's amazing here in 2022 that is a political issue. Why is that not just widely accepted? So we're advocating, we're creating awareness, we are doing public awareness campaigns, but we know that there is a direct link between when women have pay equity and are able to move themselves out of poverty. So all of these issues that we're talking about, when you talk about domestic violence increasing, when we see women have more power and agency over their own finances, then we can see them moving out of these situations and finally turning the tide.
Oh, I was just going to say, also thinking about this gun violence piece, and we universally need less guns out there. We have to be, there's so much around, the absence or of ability to regulate it. And they kill people, right? And then the ones, right, like these semi-automatic and automatic weapons, why are we letting people, walk around with them?
I just don't understand that. You can't drive a tank down the street, right? It should be, these semi-automatic weapons should absolutely be banned. We're the overproduction of guns in this country, and access to guns is absolutely, mind-blowing. And you mentioned Why Women Vote. At the top of that poll, what women said really revolved around safety. Women want to be safe. They want their families to be safe. They want their children to be safe. And I think we've really got to be able to tackle gun violence.
So I do want to say just a couple of things about that, because there is a general sense that gun access, first of all, there are more guns in the United States than people. So just keep that in mind. More guns than people, which to me is pretty bonkers. But gun access is not as controversial an issue as people think it is. Like, if you look at the polling, a broad majority of people across the political spectrum, gun owners, non-gun owners, agree that domestic abusers should not have guns. Like, there's broad consensus. Most people across the political spectrum, gun owners, non-gun owners, believe that you should have to undergo a background check to get a gun. There are all these like really basic common sense policies that people agree on, and then somehow it doesn't translate into policy, which is kind of undemocratic, but it is what it is. But I do just want to say also, we have made a little progress in the last couple of years, so I do just want to highlight a couple of wins, as well as, we all know the setbacks with like the Bruin case in the Supreme Court and things like that. But we did make some progress in VAWA, in the Violence Against Women Act, closed a loophole that was allowing people in a particular swath of the country who would be convicted under local laws. It allowed them to evade the federal law that prohibits domestic abusers from having guns. We in VAWA also included a couple of provisions related to making sure that people who are prohibited from having guns don't get them and are held accountable when they do. And then you all, I'm sure, are familiar with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and I'm sure you can talk a little bit more about Uvalde and the impact that had, being as it was not too far from you. But that again, that bill partially, I'm going to underline that, partially closed the dating loophole for people who are convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, although it still remains for people who are subject to protective orders. So we are making incremental steps, and just from just conversations I've had, and being a lobbyist, just over the last 8 years, people's perceptions have changed. Like on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, people are starting to get it a little bit more. So I'm going to be a little hopeful, and I will also say that I do not think we're going to get another big guns bill anytime soon. But this, when we're talking about issues related to equity and equality, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we're still inching forward. It's not quite the same in the gun violence space. I think we're kind of diverging depending on where you are in the country, but there is still some forward momentum, even at the same time that we have horrible Supreme Court cases like Bruin.
I will say the momentum, even in Texas after Uvalde, has been to limit guns and to move for greater gun control, and we have to keep that momentum going. With policy and so that another tragedy doesn't happen so soon again. But for sure in Texas, where there's a movement to restrict guns.
And one of the linchpins in this conversation is actually the impact on victims and survivors. In a lot of states where they are looking at rolling back protections, so like rolling back requirements for permits to carry concealed weapons, for example, like one of the big arguments that people are raising is around domestic violence and saying, hey, if you don't have a permitting system, you can have these people who, evade a background check and they're walking around with a concealed weapon when they're prohibited under state or federal law from having guns. Or, they're well known in their communities to pose a danger, but they just, there's no law that requires any screening. So actually raising intimate partner violence in a lot of these context is really changing the conversation, because people are starting to recognize A, armed abusers are dangerous, and B, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience intimate partner violence. So everybody knows someone, right? It's not just like those other people over there and it doesn't affect me. It might not affect me personally, or it might, but it affects someone I know and I care about, right?
I just want to shift a minute and talk about police violence and gender-based violence and that intersection and how all this really impacts survivors today. I think there's so much that we can see happening in any part of the country on any given day in America. And there is a cost associated with that. So we'd love anyone's thoughts on that. But Rachel particularly, would love to hear yours. But Terra, Francesca, please.
Well, I can start. I think we all know that law enforcement, they do have higher rates of intimate partner violence within the law enforcement community than within the broader community. We also know that justice is not blind, and systems in general in the United States are built to support white men and to, not support women, people of color. It's just, a legacy of how these systems were built. And, I think we in the domestic violence movement, particularly white women from, generations before, kind of bought into this model of the police as the solution, and built through VAWA and through other programs, built a system in which police were the solution and without room for other solutions. And, people don't want to call law enforcement that has traditionally victimized their communities, right? That has traditionally, caused harm. And if that is their only recourse, it's like, do I stay in an abusive relationship or do I call law enforcement, who will probably arrest me and take my kids away? It's not a system that works for everybody, but it also is a system that works for some people, right? So it's so important that we meet survivors where they are with a variety of options. And that includes law enforcement for people who want that. But we need to build a system that has different options for people with different needs.
I'm just really grateful that you have brought this forward. I think this is a real gap in the way VAWA has been built, and I certainly appreciate you identifying that women, particularly women of color and Black women like myself, really don't necessarily seek safety, in the police, and that we absolutely have to build other channels. And I think, this is where YWCA and the Center for LGBTQ, the LGBTQ Center and other social service centers are just absolutely critical to this work. And the ability for VAWA to be far more culturally responsive, I think, is our big push coming up when we look at reauthorization again. And we'll need the allyship. We'll need everyone's voices together, sort of always understanding who's left out, who's left behind, and who gets lost when we build policy and practice.
Yeah, I just want to add, as someone for 8.5 years oversaw LGBTQ domestic violence legal services project, one of the number one fears of the clients I served was what happens when law enforcement comes. It was an incredible barrier, and we heard in Los Angeles in the late 2000s, right? Like, we heard so many negative interactions, right? Not taking domestic violence among lesbians seriously. Like, why are you afraid of this person? Why did you even call me out? To just multi-time likelihood of being mutually arrested if they were responding to two men in a situation. Sort of misidentification, misgendering of trans people, and all of that, again, magnified for LGBTQ BIPOC folks. I mean, this was just such a critical issue. it's, and to the point, right? It is so hard, right? If that is the system we've built to respond, when that system we know oftentimes not only just doesn't respond, sometimes it actively harms, right? It misidentifies, and people experience violence and discrimination. There's one study out there that says LGBTQ folks are about 40% likelihood to experience discrimination and violence at the hands of police. So, all of those factors kind of come into play.
I will say in San Antonio, we have implemented a call system. 2018 was a banner year for domestic violence in San Antonio. And so the city put together a call system, and calls did increase as education about this service increased. And of course, calls increased during COVID, which we all know there was a spike in domestic violence then. But I do say that the city of San Antonio sees that having comfort in calling an authority is critical for domestic violence prevention in the city.
And, I think again, we need a broad array of options for different people. But we also do need to continue some of the things that VAWA does, which is, the training, the technical assistance, to make sure that law enforcement and other first responders understand what domestic violence is, understand what sexual assault is, understand the dynamics, understand what it means to have a survivor-centered response. We need to build new systems, but we also need to make sure that the systems that do exist, flawed as they are, also provide the best service that they can.
Right, because oftentimes survivors don't have the option, right? Someone else calls law enforcement. There's mandated reporting. And so for us, even given like a legacy of challenges, we still feel like, no, we need the training. We need you to respond appropriately, because not everyone's, there's so many people who, despite kind of desire to stay out of the system, they will be brought into the system.
I just wanted to take a moment to talk about college campuses, and just oftentimes I believe that gender-based violence goes unreported, underreported, and campus police are often not sort of fully included in how we think about partnerships or reporting, safety. College campuses for survivors can be very unsafe and triggering places for individuals to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in there. I think it kind of goes to the similar, like just given a similar thing about teen dating violence is, people are more likely to experience abuse in their relationships early on, right, when they're younger. And so a lot of queer and trans people are coming out in college. It might be the first time that they have felt safe enough to be out, but haven't necessarily, there's so little education, right, on healthy relationships generally, and very little education on what that means for LGBTQ folks, that it often gets compounded on college campuses and can be, I think, a particularly both affirming space, but also poses these other dangers. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's been a lot of progress made. There definitely has been over the last 2 decades, but still, I think a space that we have to continue to bring more awareness. But I also think that goes to the fact that we got to start that awareness so much earlier. Right? Like not waiting till people get to college, right? We got to be starting this at a younger age.
So there again, in San Antonio, we were teaching teen dating violence prevention in schools. And then there was actually a legislative movement to require it. Last June, the governor vetoed it, but it was brought back. But now parents have to opt in to allow their children. So they're giving parents the option to keep their children from getting that really important education. But you're right, it needs to start as young as middle school.
Well, and here's the thing. If domestic violence is cyclical, our parents who have been abusive to their spouse going to opt their children into the program that is going to, avoid the next generation experiencing that. And I think this is something that, it goes back to the question of the police as well as in schools, is the importance of multidisciplinary teams, right? Like, have everybody at the table. Have the campus law enforcement at the table, have the city law enforcement at the table, have the student health at the table, have the local programs at the table, have the LGBTQ club at the table, have the voices of color at the table, have survivors at the table. Because if you want a holistic and effective response, you need everybody to work together in a way that is focused on the outcomes for the survivors. And focused on what the survivors are telling you they need, rather than what a person who is not a survivor and has the best intentions in the world, but without that actual personal experience, doesn't actually truly know.
So I was going to ask you all about some systemic changes that we might want to see, but you've kind of been giving us a lot of those systemic changes throughout this conversation. So I think I have one question to ask you, and that's just because in a little less than 3 weeks, as Margaret mentioned earlier, we're going to be heading to the polls as a nation, and so will our listeners. So I'd just kind of like for you to share with all of us, what's one thing our listeners can do to make sure that survivors are centered as they continue to engage voters in their communities?
So, vote, right? But really, when people go out there, like I think about all this legislation that is happening in state houses, I really want people to be out there voting, like who are the people who are going to bring forward and champion racial justice, champion LGBTQ rights, reproductive justice, right? And immigration justice, right? Those things. And make sure that our elected officials know that these are the issues we care about and that these are the ways we're going to vote. And hopefully that is going to help us move in the direction of making these longer term shifts.
And I think when we talk about voting, people get, I think there's a lot more coverage in the media and everything of national races, but your local and state races are so important, right? Yes, the president is very exciting and Congress is very exciting. But if you want to actually, where are the levers for change that actually has an immediate impact on people, that's often at the state and local level. So don't just turn out for the national races. Really focus on those state and locals as well.
Please turn out for the school boards.
Yes, turn out for the school boards, 100%, and the secretaries of state. Vote.
I would say in Texas right now, women are a political football, and it could feel like there's a war on women, especially poor women of color. So vote in Texas. But to your point, yes, all races matter. I've even heard that the railroad commissioner in Texas is an important vote. And of course, reinstating VAWA and supporting ordinances at the local level that give equal pay rights teeth. It's unbelievable that we don't have an equal pay law in this country, and it has to happen at the local level. So support representatives who support equal pay.
And actually, I do have one more thing to add, and that's we know we have seen a lot of voter suppression laws recently. So make sure you know what you need to vote. If you need to bring documents, make sure that you are registered enough in advance, that you haven't been purged from the voting rolls. All of those things that are making it harder to vote. Don't let them win. First of all, don't give in to the pressure to not vote because they're trying to make it so hard. But also just make sure that you're educated about what needs to happen.
Thank you, Rachel. I was just going to mention voter suppression as well. I think when I think about Get Out the Vote and the YWCA, that really is our superpower. We are very much focused on supporting individuals that are have more difficulty in getting registered to vote, and encouraging those folks to make sure that they have all the information when they do go to vote. That really is where we live, I think, with our Get Out the Vote work. It's almost case management focused on voting rights, and that's what we do. And so we may not be registering huge numbers, but we are registering deeply, and we are registering in the margins, and we are ensuring that those without a voice are able to have one woman, one man, one vote in our democracy. And that is what is so exciting about our Get Out the Vote work. We have a number of invited guests with us today, and I want to make sure that our audience is able to ask some questions, because this is quite a group that we have assembled. And so if there's anything that you would like to ask of this group, please do. We're just here for all of you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And just sharing all of your, expertise with us. It's been really great to hear you all so far. And it was so great of a conversation. I have many questions, but I'm going to start with kind of a bigger question I had on a personal note, and kind of as we considered like the call of safety that was highlighted in the recent findings from the Why Women Vote study. I'm really curious about how we can create like safety for survivors who might be looking to firearms for safety. As a young queer woman of color who lives alone and is a survivor myself, I, even though considering myself anti-gun, have considered arming myself against threats of, racial and gender-based violence as of recently. And part of this reason is because, I experienced violence and was re-traumatized, as you mentioned, when I called the police, when I tried to ask for them to help, when they stepped in, and they blamed me for a lot of what happened. And so, the bottom line is that I don't feel protected, right? I feel the need to take my protection into my own hands because I don't know of many support systems or communities that will help me. So for someone like me, I'm curious as to some actual alternatives y'all might suggest to help build safety and empower other survivors to access the protection that they need, and what your practical advice is for survivors.
So I will tell you that I do public policy, so practical advice is not my expertise, but I can answer. I do just want to say, I think that is a very common desire in this country to have a firearm because it's so normalized. I do just want to tell you that all the data shows that it actually puts you at greater risk of firearm injury, firearm homicide, and suicide as well. Women who purchase firearms are actually twice more likely to die of intimate partner homicide by a firearm, because firearms are very frequently used against survivors. The abuser will take the firearm and use it. Obviously, if that is something that you do choose to pursue, I think we always want to support the autonomy of the survivor, right? And so we don't want to tell a survivor, like, that is absolutely wrong. But, a survivor also needs to be ready to shoot to kill, right? And that's possibly killing someone they have feelings for, maybe the parent of their child. And also recognizing that, as we have said, we live in a country that is not necessarily just, and particularly for women of color, are likely, we all saw what happened with Marissa Alexander, who fired a warning shot in Florida, which has a stand your ground law, didn't come close to hitting him, and still went to jail for attempted murder, right? So, I think a lot of it is building relationships with people who you can call, who can step in. This is not an official position of NCADV, but I would say get a dog.
I do. I'm in the process.
But I think that there are other ways that don't involve firearms, which can put you actually at greater risk at the end of the day.
So I'm really sorry that was your experience. That unfortunately it is too common. It shouldn't be the case. Right? Like, that's why we have to do this work. And thank you for sharing. And also, I I literally was having this conversation with my friend last night. It's scary out there. And I know everything Rachel is saying about like that it actually puts you more at risk. And I feel like, and it also sometimes feels as someone who walks the world as a queer woman, and that there is so much, like, you know, it's so constant that like those both overt and subvert sort of threats. And I feel like what we are trying to do is how do we create community? And because I don't think there's just not a perfect answer, but also to the extent that we can walk the world with other people who share our values, that I think there's at least a movement towards safety in that. But I just, again, I fully hear what you're saying, and so much work to be done.
Collective sigh.
I'll weigh in too and just say, yeah, I could totally see the desire to want to buy a firearm to protect yourself. But to everyone's point, echoing building community, I could tell a story of a young childcare worker in our center who was her abusive ex-husband was out of prison and threatening her, and came to our center looking for her. One tactic would be to ensure that everyone around you in your nearby community knows that you're going through this, so that this is a piece of information that can't be used against you, and that your employer knows that you're dealing with this, and that your closest friends can be there as a source of protection for you as well.
I did have one other question that kind of connects to this one, and the idea of community was that specifically in the queer community, a lot of times the people who experience the most domestic and intimate partner violence are trans women of color and like bisexual people, which, you know, is an intersection that I know very well. And so I just wonder like how we can, not just as YWCA, but as a nation, be better at providing care for women who, like you said, stand at the intersections and who might be considering these things, and exactly what is YWCA doing to kind of do that work or take them.
Well, our YWCA takes an educational approach with our youth services, with our adult services, and we know that trans women of color are more likely than other women to experience it. So just educating the community and elevating their voices. We know that in all of these issues that we're talking about, the LGBTQ community feels invisible because they feel like they're right in the gap. So how do we elevate their voices to be a part of the conversation?
Yeah, and I guess just not speaking as the why, since I'm not, but kind of highlighting what you said and kind of building off of that. One is just the clear lack of data collection, right? Like there is so little data, but the data that does exist and that has finally started to trickle out, I mean, we are seeing significantly higher rates of violence. I think in the case of bisexual women, nearly 60% of bisexual women will experience intimate partner violence over the course of their lifetime. That's one of the highest rates, right? And then you break that out for bisexual women of color. And so part of that is how do we try to eliminate bisexual invisibility, both within LGBTQ spaces as well as within what are historically been mainstream cisgender kind of heterosexual spaces. And then also, at the National LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Institute, we're hoping to bring attention and do specific trainings around these issues. And then from a service provision standpoint, I'm also looking at how are we doing economic empowerment? How are, so many trans people experience job discrimination, right? Like, how are we ensuring that people have access to good jobs with livable wages, right? That where people can not just survive, but thrive. And so I think there's just so much of how are we bringing together all these components. And and again, really centering people at the margins, knowing that if we can do that, right? we're gonna be able to help so many more and help so many more who are disproportionately impacted by violence.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people don't talk about the economic piece. That's like escaping is not only dangerous, it's expensive. It's hard to, maybe have to rent a car to get away or get a hotel or whatnot. Like, it's not easy or cheap to find safety. So I really appreciate y'all, doing that work and bringing that up.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessie. Wonderful discussion that we've been having. I think my question is, we're centering survivors, but what happens to the survivors that, are kind of surviving and getting through day to day? What would you recommend to take them to the next level? Because we all know surviving is great in that moment, but there's a moment where you want to start thriving outside of surviving. So what are some practical things that they can do to ensure that they can get to that point?
I always think, and this is a conversation that I've had with a couple of you, is that getting to thriving is not linear. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't, sort of happen because you hit month X or somebody tells you, it's time to move on. Is very much an up and down cyclical process and can be different for everyone, just as safety. And what it means to be safe can be different, for everyone. And so I think it's so important to really be involved and engaged in building your community and building belonging. And when you're able to be actively involved in pursuing your wellness. And there's something about trauma that just comes and knocks on the door and lets you know I'm here and you need to pay attention. And that we don't mute those voices with quick grabs to sort of misuse and dampen those feelings. It's just a really hard road to come through, and I think we all need to create space in which we are working together and supporting those things.
I would just lift up when trauma wants to come knock on your door, it's there. We have a workforce training program in partnership with the City of San Antonio again, and you have to be a San Antonio resident to be a part of that workforce program. And we had a woman getting her life back together, and she was on the path to get certified for a high demand career, and then her abusive ex-husband found her, and she had to relocate to a city outside of San Antonio, and so that just disrupted her trajectory. So that's just a story to show that it is not linear, as you mentioned, and that the community has to be there for protection, and so that this it doesn't remain something this person has to run from for the rest of her life.
And I think there's we talked a lot about the importance of community building and having a supportive community, and that includes making sure that people understand what domestic violence is and are there and get it, right? And get that it's not linear, and don't judge because you made a choice that's different from what they would have made, right? And just to be surrounded by people who, who support non-judgmentally and caringly, meet you where you are, not where they think you should be.
And I would say my last question.
I was just going to say, regarding YWCA, I think that, we've been historically, a cisgendered organization, and I think that we do well at being an organization that is focused on belonging, and we have a lot of work to do in this space. But I think the one thing about the YWCA is that we're always willing to sort of acknowledge that we have some work to do and get ourselves aligned with partners because our work in housing and in early childhood education, we have an incredible ability across the country to touch community and families through those and other areas, our work with young people. And so the internal work, right, is so important that we continue to examine our own biases and areas where we are trailing behind with our staff and our partners, and be upfront about our ability that we have needs of growth in this area. And we have associations that are excelling and so much to learn from them, and other partners like NCADV and the LGBTQ Center as partners. We can get where we need to go, but we can't get there by ourselves. And it's just critical work. And yes, I just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. No, as those who sit at the intersection, it's our job to continue to grow and build community, because that intersection people are always going through. I think of it as like a road, there's always going to be more people coming, so we always got to get on board for the rest person. But I was going to say my last question was just a lot of, I think, the way that the pandemic has not only affected the domestic violence space, but also just the general way that we think of things, is that people are scared. Like, it's been a scary time. It's created a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty, which has caused a kind of a railroading of different things that have happened. And so just, the collective impact of the last 2 years cannot be understated on almost every facet of society. We've all been changed. So I just curious as to how, how the pandemic specifically and the fallout that came after it has changed the work that we do. And also, what challenges have you had to overcome in order to be able to continue to provide these critical services to survivors of gender and sexual violence?
I'll start about just on the practical level. At YWCA San Antonio, we have a child care center all in one place, and we're being required to create structural changes to our building. All child care classrooms have to have a door that go to the parking lot, for example. We've had an old rickety door for 45 years, and now we have to get a bulletproof glass and vestibule put in so that we can see people coming and going. So that's on the practical level. We received calls probably weekly from women looking for safe places to live during the pandemic. And we used our own emergency funds to put them up in hotels. But last year we purchased a property and are moving into housing and are going to be able to provide housing. We have a houseless crisis in San Antonio right now, and we've seen a growth in families led by single mothers who are leaving abusive situations. So affordable housing is something that we all need to look into. For survivors. That's one major way to center survivors economically and with their health and wellness.
Yeah, so our organization, we have more than 750 staff members, and we provide comprehensive social services, from a federally qualified healthcare center to housing for homeless youth, to a senior center, affordable housing for seniors, and so much more. And during the pandemic, when a lot of people were able to work off-site, about half of our staff had to stay on just to keep the 24/7 and the health services operating. So a couple things coming out of that. One is, I think we're really having to examine, how do we work, right? Like, what is our culture of work? What are the expectations? How do we evolve? Our senior services, we did a lot online that was successful. We opened our trans support groups, expanded dramatically by allowing virtual, but also how do you create community entirely virtually? And so figuring out those balances. So I think that's on some of the employment side of things, but then there's this other piece of the social and emotional toll that pandemic took. So we are seeing much higher acuity rates, right? Increased level of challenges with people's mental illness, increased substance misuse, and higher level. We're seeing a lot of dual pandemic, kind of issues coming together, where you have homelessness, crystal meth use, violence, right? And like just the acuity rate is so much more, and the need for services is so much greater that I think I feel like most social services organizations right now are like struggling under that weight to like respond. And we're trying to figure it out right now. Because it is a challenge. And I guess lastly on that, I mean, as a community that has just kind of gone through an additional pandemic of the human monkeypox virus, which we just saw, tear through the gay and bi male community with so little support, once again, that and that disproportionately falls on social service providers to respond. And so I'm just going to go back to this. We need to vote. We need to demand accountability from our elected officials, and we have to build the community to continue to provide and support, because as to fill in those gaps, because unfortunately it's going to take a while to catch government.
And funding.
And funding,
and
right?
Lots
Exactly.
of funding for social services.
Yes, thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much for answering them.
This is not a silver lining. It's not a pewter lining. It might possibly be like a graphite lining. I don't know, but
Love the texture.
Yeah, it's definitely not silver. Not even aluminum. I do think though that the pandemic did force us to consider the ways that we've always done things and whether those were the right ways for everybody, right? And they aren't. Having a place for people to go is great for people who can go there. Mm-hmm. But for people who, maybe have limited mobility or don't have a car or transportation or childcare or, all of these, or can't leave because there's somebody, the neighbors are watching them on behalf of again, when I think we really started taking a stronger look at meeting survivors where they are. And that includes mobile services, going to you instead of requiring you to come to us. That, courts have changed to do, electronic filing protective orders and electronic hearings. Just we've been forced to rethink the way we do things. And in some ways, I think once all the dust clears, our response will be stronger as a result. But that is maybe a little bit down the road. So that's why it's graphite.
Thank you so much.
I want to make sure that I want to just let everyone know that will be the last question for us today. And I want to thank you for the questions. It's always, I always think, just such a impactful. And I was like, let's see, maybe, let's see if we can have some engagement. So thank you. And Caitlin, thank you so much for joining me on this panel. And Terra, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in California and nationally.
Thank you.
It is just really powerful and important, and I really continue to encourage you to elevate, Black and Brown individuals within the LGBTQ movement, and because so much equity is needed there. And Rachel, thank you. I mean, just really amazing. Policy does matter, and that's one of the threads that came through in the Why Women Vote is that women do believe in policy, and they believe that policy has an impact on change. And we partner nationally and of course locally with so many of our YWCAs, and of course my sister Francesca in the sisterhood. It's so we have been on phone calls, on Zoom meetings, but we have never actually met in person before today. And it's just so delightful to meet you. We do a challenge, a racial equity challenge. I remember years ago, Francesca and her team saying, I think we could translate this into Spanish. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's making all my dreams come true. And so I just thank you for your partnership over the years and your work in the network. It's really very important. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We could probably continue this conversation all day, but it is time to bring it to a close. I want to thank Francesca, Terra, and Rachel for joining us today and bringing their expertise to this very important issue. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Amber Reed, our Director of Grants Management and Development for YWCA USA. Today, Amber will be presenting the Week Without Violence Fund to grantees for 2022.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you for your visionary leadership. Hello, everyone. My name is Amber Reed, the Director of Grants Management and Development at YWCA USA. As we conclude our Week Without Violence, Centering Survivors, we wanted to take a moment to highlight our grant recipients for 2022. This year, we received 59 strong applications from associations with gender-based violence outreach programs, temporary and transitional housing, emergency shelters, and client assistance services. Our selection committee had the privilege of reviewing all applications and the challenge of selecting only 10 local associations when we know the need is high for all. Thanks to our amazing partnership with Torrid, we are excited to share that we will award an additional 5 awardees for a grand total of $225,000 to 15 local associations. $15,000 is awarded to each local association in one of 3 categories: capital improvements, client assistance, and prevention programming. This year's recipients represent a diverse range of programs and services provided in response to their community's needs related to survivors of domestic violence. Congratulations to the following local associations. For capital improvements, YWCA Bradford, YWCA Cass Clay, YWCA Dayton, YWCA Mohawk Valley, YWCA Utah, and YWCA York. For client assistance, YWCA Bucks County, YWCA Charleston, YWCA St. Joseph, YWCA Northwest Ohio, and YWCA Tulsa. And for prevention programs, YWCA Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, YWCA Southampton Roads, YWCA Southern Arizona, and YWCA Spokane. In accordance with our new equity in grant making value statement, YWCA strives for equity in its grant making processes. In addition to the eligibility criteria listed, the Grant Selection Committee took into consideration equity benchmarks when making grant awards. Those benchmarks included the racial makeup of the applicant's service area, if the applicant is a BIPOC-led organization, previous funding levels to the applicant, regional distribution of grants, organizational size, population size of service area, and other factors. This commitment aligns with the YWCA strategic business plan to create equity in grant making across the network. Thank you again to all applicants. We hope to continue to build a more equitable grants process and provide more financial support over the next year, and we encourage everyone to please apply. Please be on the lookout for our next development webinar on Wednesday, November the 2nd at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be joined by Meta to discuss charitable giving using Facebook and Instagram as we prepare for Giving Tuesday in the end of year giving season. Thank you for all that you do to support the mission of YWCA every day. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, and congratulations to all of our Week Without Violence grantees for 2022. We now find ourselves in a moment as a nation where there is so much at stake for survivors. In leading YWCA USA, I am extraordinarily proud of the work we do every single day to eliminate racism and empower women. It's opportunities like this that keep all of us at YWCA energized and inspired by this work. Moments where we can lift up strong women, leaders, and engage all of you who have joined us here today to take action to eliminate gender-based violence and support survivors. This town hall is actually part of a larger Week Without Violence that has been happening locally in YWCAs all across the country. And I hope that you'll stay engaged with your local association. Earlier this week, activists from around the country reached out to Congress to advocate for the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act and the Women's Health Protection Act. You can now support this effort by joining us on social media using hashtag WWV22 and hashtag Centering Survivors and tagging YWCA. We also hope that you'll take action by using the Act Now button on the YWCA website so that you can encourage your senators and representatives to act now. Tomorrow, I hope that you'll engage with us in a Twitter storm from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and this will be hosted by the YWCA USA team. We will continue our conversation about today's topic regarding the divisive issues that impact survivors. You can participate on Twitter by using hashtag WWV22. And on Saturday, we're encouraging all survivors, providers, activists, and advocates that we know to take a day of self-care. Taking time to engage in healing and self-care is an absolute integral part of your own mental and physical well-being. And we hope and we know that it will make you an even more powerful advocate for yourself, your community, and your clients. You'll receive a follow-up email from all of us with details about Week Without Violence, and I do hope you'll stay engaged. A big mission like eliminating racism and empowering women needs as many allies as we can. Thank you for joining us. And now it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce Pam Ewan, Director of Government Relations for YWCA USA.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you to all our speakers for your time to center survivors this critical Week Without Violence and National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today, we find ourselves just over 2 weeks from Election Day, and the stakes for women, children, families, and survivors couldn't be higher. The issues you heard today and that have been reconfirmed by YWCA's 5th Why Women Vote survey will be on the ballot this November. That's why now, more than ever, it is critical that we head to the polls this election season with these issues in mind. So before we conclude today's event, we have 3 final reminders for our audience. Number 1, as you prepare to head to the ballot box this November, YWCA is calling on all voters to educate themselves on where your candidates stand on issues, particularly at the intersection of gender-based violence and race. We need your help to ensure that survivors' voices and concerns are at the forefront of this election season and beyond. Not sure about where your candidates stand on particular issues? Continue to engage with your elected officials by hosting a candidate forum focused on gender-based violence, help voters get out to the polls, or other get out the vote engagement efforts this year. Ask questions about the policies and solutions candidates would pursue to end gender-based violence and support survivors. And finally, go to www.whywomenvote.org for more information. Number 2, find out more about where your candidates and members of Congress stand on the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, FVPSA, as well as the Women's Health Protection Act. FVPSA provides critical funding that survivors rely on for domestic violence services such as housing, emergency shelter, transportation, childcare, and medical and legal counseling. If passed, this bill would help ensure much-needed funding reaches domestic violence survivors. Also, we heard today about the devastating impact that the lack of abortion access and care and other reproductive health care can have on victims of survivors of gender-based violence. The Women's Health Protection Act takes critical steps to codify safe, legal abortion services and also protects providers offering abortions and other critical health services. Together, these two bills are critical to centering the support and health of survivors, and we're calling on you to find out more about where your candidates and members of Congress stand on these critical issues. And finally, number 3, join the YWCA Action Center to tell your members of Congress to pass these critical bills. As we speak, both bills have not been passed in the upper chamber. We need your help to contact your senators and tell them to bring these bills to the floor without delay. Take 2 minutes by going to the YWCA Action Center and make your voice heard on these critical issues now. Week Without Violence is part of a global movement with YWCAs across the country and around the world to end violence against women and girls. But the success we've seen over the years wouldn't be possible without engagement from advocates like you. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you at the ballot box on November 8th.
I just wanted to take a moment and thank the YWCA community for the work you do on behalf of democracy. Our Get Out the Vote work is not about standing on a corner and passing out registration cards. We enable the most difficult to get registered to be able to vote. That is the work of the YWCA, and I'm so grateful for what you do every single day to ensure that people, particularly those that others see in the margins, are able to vote. Thank you.